Hello again, it's Dr. Robert Guthrie. We're back with our Sunday school lesson, and I'm certain you all remember that we're working our way through and now we're into Second Kings, and this deals with the travails and agony and suffering and the prophets of the divided kingdoms. Last time the kingdoms had split, the northern kingdom got mad at the southern kingdom and basically broke away, created their own monarchy. It was chaos. The people kept getting killed and overthrown, and there'd be one royal family, and then they would all get killed. Another royal family would take over. They'd last one or two times, and they'd get killed. One guy lasted 7 days, and so he got killed. It was not a time I would have enjoyed living. That's really not my style to have government by coup, which is really what they had. So at this point, we have Ahab, who's married to Jezebel. And he's holding on as the king. His father Omri had been a successful king, but Ahab had married Jezebel, and she was nothing but trouble. She had the duel with Elijah last time. Elijah's still around, and Jezebel is still around. But Ahab's the king of Israel, and he's being attacked by the king of Aram, Aram. Aram is actually southern Syria, the area around Damascus. These names change over time. So he's besieged in Samaria by the king of Aram, which is from Syria. And Aram demands all the gold and silver in the kingdom as a payoff, bribe to go away. And Ahab agrees to that. That's only money. And then the king of Aram demands all the king's wives and concubines. And I thought, wow, this guy had a chance to get rid of Jezebel. He should have said, well, I'll just give you my wife. You can have her, and her father's the king of Tyre over in Lebanon. He had a chance to get rid of her, but he says no to that one. Why he said no is beyond me. But at this point, an unnamed prophet appears. No name, he appears. He has several prophetic things, and he tells Ahab that you're going to have victory over these invaders, and what you need to do is get ready to attack them in the middle of the day. So Ahab sorties, the sortie, S-O-R-T-I-E, is the term for when you're inside an entrenchment and they're outside and you want to sneak out or charge out and attack them. That's a sortie. So he sorties out in the middle of the day because the king of Aram gets drunk in the middle of the day in his tent. And so he becomes a little bit less than capable. So he attacks them then and routs them and drives them back and drives them away, and they leave. The prophet then, the king of Aram gets reorganized. He basically dumps these kings he had for military commanders and gets professional soldiers in, and comes back to reattack and siege Samaria, the capital. The prophet again predicts victory, and so he attacks again and wins. Ahab does, and he also captures the king of Aram. And he and the king of Aram make a treaty, which seems perfectly reasonable to me. It's easier to have a treaty and stop fighting than it is to keep fighting. So he releases the king of Aram. This prophet goes nuts and says, God had told you had to kill this guy. I'm glad I wasn't a king in an old ancient time, because I really wouldn't be inclined to kill people I'd captured, particularly when they were willing to make a treaty with him. But the prophet calls down curses on Ahab for sparing the king of Aram. So he says that his royal family will be overthrown and killed, and other people will take over, etc., and then it stops there. Then you have the story most of us are familiar with from this part of the Old Testament, called Naboth's vineyard. Naboth was the guy who had a vineyard next to the royal garden, vineyard, whatever, and Jezebel decides she wants to have that. So she tells her husband, let's get that vineyard. And so the king goes to Naboth and tries to buy it. And you would think, why not buy it? It's just private property. You can sell it. He offers them all kinds of things, other land and money and all that. And Naboth refuses. Now, this is an interesting one to try to understand, because the concept around private property, which we hold very dear here in the U.S., was in different cultures, completely different. That when the Europeans arrived here in the New World and tried to buy the land from the Indians, the Native American population, they wouldn't sell it because they didn't own it individually any more than they owned the air or the water in the streams or the waterfalls or anything else or the game. They held this in common, in communion for the tribe. The tribe had these tracts of land. And ancient tribes in Africa had the same concept. They held their land in communion, in common is a good way to put it. And so when we were having the old Cold War with the Soviets, they were pushing communism. It actually took hold better in parts of Africa because the land had been held in common by the tribes all along. So it matched up with better than our concept of everything is owned privately by individuals. So, and Naboth said, hey, I don't own this land just for me. This land was given to us by God when we arrived here and conquered the Holy Land. It's been in my family. I inherited it from my family. I will pass it on to my children. This is not mine to sell. This is an inheritance, and so I can't sell it. So Ahab goes, oh, okay. He goes back to Jezebel, and she jumps him. What kind of king are you? I can imagine what she said. How could you just let this guy turn you down? You're the king. Take over here. And Ahab stands up to her and says no. So she says, I'll take care of it. This is where she gets her really bad reputation with Naboth's vineyard. So she gets two people described in my translation as scoundrels. I'm certain other translations have different words for them, but they're scoundrels. And she gets them to falsely accuse Naboth, of treason for being critical of the king and attacking the king's reputation, et cetera, and for blasphemy against God, critiquing God and saying these terrible things. Now, you need two, because in Hebrew law, one accuser had no credibility, because people would get mad at their relatives or their neighbors or their brother or this and that, and they'd make an accusation. Unless you have two, you don't get anywhere. So she knew the law well enough to get these two people, and they accused Naboth, and they were able to convince the people. And so these people take Naboth out and stone him to death. Not a nice way to go, that's for sure, to have people throw rocks at you until you're dead. And she takes over for Naboth's vineyard. They just seize it at that point. Well, Elijah's still around, and he goes ape over this. He says, this is terrible. He says to Ahab, you're a murderer. And remember, prophets had said this to King David, about Bathsheba and getting rid of her husband, Uriah the Hittite. So, and Ahab's, oh my gosh, he actually repents. He's not as bad as his wife in this story. He repents and puts on sackcloth and wears dirt and all these ritual things. So Elijah says, had originally said, your whole family is going to be destroyed by God. God's going to take revenge on you for this terrible crime. And so he repents, and Elijah changes and said, okay, God's not going to take revenge on you and your family at this time. Your family will be wiped out in a violent overthrow, but it will be on your son, not on you. I don't know how much reassurance that is, but that's what he said. And he also tells Ahab, the dogs will lick your blood. That's a nice thing to say. And the dogs will eat the flesh of Jezebel. Like I said, I'm glad I live now, not in this time. This is not a nice message. So anyway, this kind of upset Ahab. I think so. But those predictions still remain. So he said the destruction of the royal family will happen on your son's watch, not on yours, etc. So 3 years later, Ahab decides to attack Arab, the Syrian area, to the north. And he wants to get Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah. Remember, jumping Jehoshaphat was the phrase we said a long time ago when I was a kid. This is where it comes from. He's the king of the southern kingdom of Judah. Southern kingdom usually plays second fiddle to the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom is much larger and more prosperous. And so he agrees to go along in this attack on the people in Syria to the north. Ahab remembers these predictions, and he says to Jehoshaphat, well, you put your royal robes on, and I'm going to disguise myself and look like a common soldier. Because I think the people in Aram are going to be mad at me for starting this war. They actually are. They shouldn't be mad because he'd let the king go 3 years before. But I'm going to disguise myself as a common soldier. So there's this incident where the soldiers of Aram, of the kingdom in Syria, are told to find out and kill Ahab, King Ahab. So they see this one guy dressed in the royal robes, and that's Jehoshaphat. And they're about to attack him when he gives his royal war cry, and they realize that this isn't King Ahab. This is king of the southern kingdom. So they're instructed to let him go. So he flees and gets away. And they don't know what they're going to do about Ahab. And an interesting account is that a random archer fires an arrow into the air, and it comes down randomly, not aimed at him particularly. Remember, a lot of the archery wasn't that accurate in those days. They didn't have all the fancy gear we have on the lawn. They didn't have the double curved bow. They did have a double curved bow. They didn't have all the fancy bows we have now. And this arrow comes down and pierces a chink in his armor and gets him, stabs him, whether it was on the side or it doesn't really say. And he's wounded, and he gets in his chariot to be taken back to Samaria, and he dies along the way. And so his son takes over, but the chariot's all full of his blood. So they take his chariot into the pool of Samaria to wash the chariot off. And they wash the blood into the pool of Samaria, and the dogs come up and lick the water in the pool of Samaria. Living up to the prediction that the dogs will drink his blood. Nice account, okay? So if you want to skip this reading and go on to the next one, that I understand. Then it comes time for, and then his son, I forget the son's name, is succeeding him, and he's up on the balcony of the castle, several floors up, and he falls and lands hard, thunk, and he's severely injured, and he decides that he's going to ask Baal, not Yahweh, Baal, the alleged pagan god, the bad guy, to save him. And he sends messengers to the priests of Baal, and they reassure him this and that, and he's not getting any better. And he finally sends for Elijah, and Elijah said, hey, you consulted Baal, you're going to die, okay? And you are finished. And then Elijah is summoned to cross the Jordan River. It's not exactly certain why this is summoning, but he goes to cross the Jordan, and he crosses it on a dry thing, miraculously with his robe. And when he appears in the water stops, and he can cross on dry ground, like they did when they came across the first time, when Joshua and his troops crossed it at Jericho, which we explained differently as an earthquake, blocking up the river. And he crosses into Jordan, and then he is taken up into heaven in a fiery chariot. God sends a fiery chariot down from the heavens to take him up to the heaven. And this is a very odd thing to be appearing at this point. This is very challenging to me as a scholarly student of the scriptures, because this is the first mention of anything like a fiery chariot. You do see them mentioned later in Ezekiel and the much later prophetically. They talk about God sending fiery chariots down from heaven. And this is the first time you find the mention of heaven as the home of God and as the place where we go if we're appropriate with God. Because if you remember the story about Saul, when Saul's about to be overthrown by David, he has the necromancer, the witch doctor, whatever, summon up the spirit of Samuel, the prophet Samuel. What's going to happen to me? And they summoned Samuel from the underworld. The appreciation of where you went after death at that time was like the Greek Hades. You just went to this place where they parked you. It wasn't hell, it wasn't heaven, it was just there. But it wasn't going into heaven, up into the heavens. They had references to the heavens, but not into heaven as this distinct entity like the Christian heaven is. It's very, very interesting. It's the first appearance. Now, these accounts were edited and rewritten several hundred years later during the Babylonian exile, probably around 550. So the understanding of the divine presence may have matured and changed at that time. But it's the first time. So it's very challenging to see this because you don't have the mention of the underworld like Samuel was. You have this fiery chariot taking him up. Okay, so he is succeeded by Elisha. Remember, he had, after his last encounter with God down on Mount Horeb, the sacred mountain, he was to appoint Elisha to succeed him. And there are a series of dramatic miracles described by Elisha. He can make the Jordan run dry when he uses Elijah's robe and touches the water. He can turns foul water sweet by touching it or putting things in it. He cures, he raises from the dead a young boy who had died. He cures another person of his skin condition. It didn't seem to be a leprosy type skin condition. The person was not in exile. Probably eczema or psoriasis skin conditions we're familiar with now. And I don't recall other miracles in the Old Testament like this pattern until we get to the New Testament. So it's an unusual interlude of Elisha having almost divine powers to do these miracles. And finally, there's a reference of that he's in a situation where Aram is attacking Samaria again, and they besiege Samaria again. And Elisha is able to call down fiery horses and chariots. They appear to him in some way, and he predicts that the Aramean troops will abandon their siege lines. Remember, when you besieged a fortified city like Samaria, you'd enclose it with your troops to keep people from getting in or getting out and try to starve them out. He predicts that they'll flee, and they do. And suddenly their camp is empty. This is not the only time this happens. This happens down around Jerusalem 100 or so years later when the Assyrians are trying to besiege it. You really suspect that some kind of plague happened in the invaders' camp. Remember, they don't have any sanitation. They don't have a good water supply. They're down there living in tents. If you have a bubonic plague episode, which will kill you very quickly, or a smallpox episode, or some other type of infection process, it can really demolish your army in those unsafe conditions, lousy nutrition, et cetera, and so you're very vulnerable. So they go out and the camp is deserted. It must be some kind of plague that God had sent to save them. And then during this same time, the kingdom continues to struggle. Moab, which is east across the Jordan, that rebels and becomes independent. It had been conquered a long time ago. Edom to the southeast, down where Elat is now, that had been conquered, and it rebels and becomes independent. So the northern kingdom is not doing well. They're really struggling. So finally, there is a rebellion against the son of Ahab, and a man named Jehu was going to overthrow them, and he'll of course get himself overthrown later. That's just the way. It's a short half-life job being king of the northern kingdom. And so they have an interesting account, which is in the next reading, but I thought I would put it in here to show that the prediction about Jezebel comes true. They're into the palace. They've killed off her son, who had become king, and they're coming after her. So she puts on her makeup, puts on her mascara, does her eyes and all this, and waiting for them. And they burst in, and the henchmen grab her, and they think about what are they going to do with her. And Jehu says, throw her over the balcony down onto the ground. So it's a couple-story palace. So they throw her over, and she smashes down on whether there's pavement or dirt. It's not clear. And then he rides over her with his horses, leaving her bloody. Like I said, aren't you glad you live now rather than live then? And then he goes in to eat and drink and have a festival. And he says later to the guys, well, go out and recover her body so we can give her a proper burial. She was the queen after all. So they go out. All they find left are some of her bones, her skull, her hands, and her feet. And the rest had been consumed by the dogs, just like Elijah had predicted a number of years ago. On this cheery note, we'll stop. And we're plowing through Kings, and we're going to finish this history of murder and overthrow pretty soon. The reading for next time, yes, it is 2 Kings, only 9 through 13, because I want you to read the prophet Amos. Amos is one of my favorites. Amos is fun. He's the first of the great prophets that really leaves a written account. Elijah leaves no written account personally. Amos puts together a written account, and it's very interesting reading. And this is the first prophet talking about we have responsibilities to care for the poor and downtrodden in society, not just to run the society for the benefit of the king and the rich and powerful. This is Dr. Guthrie. We'll see you in a week. Thank you.